You can solve this?
I think I can.
Wait, that's impossible. You were right.
Nobody in that university paid attention to the quiet black cleaning lady until a professor decided to make her the joke of his class. He wrote an equation so difficult that even his best students struggled with it, then challenged her to solve it. The room erupted in laughter. But 3 minutes later, nobody was laughing anymore. Every morning, long before most students walked through the doors of Westbrook University, Evelyn Carter was already there. She pushed her cleaning cart through the quiet hallways, wiping fingerprints from glass doors, emptying trash cans, and making sure the classrooms looked perfect before the first lecture began. She was a black woman in her late 40s, always dressed in the same simple navy uniform, with her hair neatly tied back and a calm expression that rarely changed. Most people knew her only as the cleaning lady. Students would walk past her while staring at their phones. Professors would step around her without saying a word. Sometimes someone would leave a coffee cup on a desk right after she had cleaned it, and Evelyn would simply pick it up and keep working. She never complained. She never demanded attention. But there was something about her that didn't quite fit the picture people had created in their minds. Whenever she cleaned the mathematics building, she moved slower near the classrooms where professors were teaching. She would glance through the open doors and quietly listen. Numbers, formulas, and mathematical symbols seemed to catch her attention in a way they didn't catch most people's. One morning, she stopped outside Professor Daniel Harris's advanced mathematics class. On the board was a complicated equation, and several students were struggling to understand it. Evelyn stood there for only a few seconds before quietly looking down at the floor and continuing with her work. One student noticed her and smiled. "You understand that stuff," he joked. Evelyn gave him a small smile and said a little. Then she walked away. What nobody at the university knew was that Evelyn hadn't always been a cleaning lady. Years earlier, she had spent her nights surrounded by textbooks instead of cleaning supplies. She had loved mathematics since she was a child, and once dreamed of becoming a professor herself. Life, however, had taken her down a completely different road. After a series of painful personal setbacks, she had been forced to put those dreams aside and find work wherever she could. She never told anyone about her education. She never talked about the awards she had once received or the professors who had believed she could go far. To everyone at Westbrook University, she was simply the woman who cleaned their classrooms, and that was exactly how she wanted it, at least for now. But everything was about to change the morning Professor Harris noticed her watching his equation. He had no idea that the quiet woman standing beside his classroom door understood mathematics on a level that would soon leave his entire class speechless. Professor Daniel Harris was one of the most respected mathematics professors at Westbrook University, and he knew it. He had spent years building a reputation as the man who could solve problems that left other people staring at the board in confusion. His lectures were always packed, partly because students wanted to learn from him and partly because they never knew what kind of challenge he would throw at them next. Daniel enjoyed being the smartest person in the room, and he wasn't shy about showing it. If a student gave a wrong answer, he would smile and say, "Think again," before solving the problem himself in front of everyone. Most students respected his intelligence, but some quietly admitted that he could be hard to deal with. He had a habit of turning difficult questions into little performances, especially when visiting professors or important university staff were watching. One Thursday morning, Daniel walked into his advanced mathematics class carrying a folder filled with notes. He looked unusually confident. "Today," he told the students, "we're going to work on something that separates people who understand mathematics from people who simply memorize formulas." A few students exchanged nervous looks. Daniel wrote a long equation across the board, filling almost the entire surface with symbols, fractions, and variables. The room became quiet. Even his strongest students stared at it for several seconds before anyone picked up a pen. Daniel smiled because this was exactly what he wanted. He walked between the desks, watching everyone struggle. Then, through the open classroom door, he noticed Evelyn Carter pushing her cleaning cart down the hallway. She stopped for a moment when she saw the equation. Her eyes moved from one side of the board to the other. Daniel noticed her looking and raised an eyebrow. "You know what?" he said loud enough for the class to hear. "Maybe we should ask our cleaning staff." A few students laughed. Evelyn looked surprised. She had not expected to be part of the lesson. Daniel stepped toward the doorway with a playful grin. "What do you think, Ms. Carter? Can you solve it?" More laughter came from the classroom. Evelyn didn't answer immediately. She looked at the equation again. Daniel expected her to smile awkwardly, shake her head, and walk away. Instead, she slowly parked her cleaning cart beside the wall. Then she looked directly at the professor and said something that wiped the smile from his face. "I think I can." The students laughed even harder. Daniel laughed too, but inside, he was already thinking about how entertaining the next few minutes were going to be. He had no idea that his little joke was about to become the most embarrassing lesson of his career. For a few seconds, nobody in the classroom knew what to say after Evelyn calmly told Professor Harris that she thought she could solve the equation. Then one student laughed, and soon several others joined in. Daniel smiled, enjoying the attention. He had expected Evelyn to back down, but instead she stood there beside her cleaning cart, looking at the board as if the complicated symbols meant something completely different to her. "Well," Daniel said, leaning against his desk, "why don't you come up here and give it a try?" His voice had that playful tone that made it clear he wasn't seriously expecting her to succeed. Evelyn looked around the room. She saw 20 students watching her, some curious, others amused. For a moment, she seemed to consider walking away. Then she quietly pushed her cart against the wall and stepped inside. One of the students whispered, "This should be interesting." Another laughed under his breath. Evelyn ignored them. She walked toward the board and picked up a piece of chalk. Daniel folded his arms. "Take your time," he joked. "We have all morning." A few students laughed again. Evelyn looked at him and gave a small, calm smile. "I won't need all morning." That answer changed the mood for just a second. Daniel's smile faded slightly, but he quickly laughed it off. "Okay, Ms. Carter, show us what you've got." Evelyn turned toward the equation. She didn't start writing immediately. Instead, she studied the entire problem from beginning to end. Her eyes moved carefully across every line. The classroom slowly became quieter. Even the students who had been laughing started watching her more closely. Daniel expected her to make a basic mistake within seconds. He was already imagining the joke he would make afterward, but then Evelyn wrote down the first step. It wasn't random, it was clean and precise. Daniel's eyes narrowed. She wrote another line, then another. One of the students sitting near the front leaned forward. "Wait," he whispered, "she's simplifying it." Daniel didn't answer. Evelyn continued working, completely focused. The laughter had disappeared. The room was now almost silent, except for the sound of chalk moving across the board. Daniel stepped closer, trying to understand exactly what she was doing. He recognized the method, but he hadn't expected anyone to spot it so quickly. Evelyn paused for a moment and looked back at him. "Professor, you made one small mistake when you wrote the third term." Daniel froze. He turned toward the board and checked it. She was right. The mistake was small, but it changed the entire problem. Suddenly, this wasn't funny anymore. Daniel erased the term, corrected it, and looked back at Evelyn. She simply turned toward the board and continued solving. Nobody laughed this time. They were waiting to see what would happen next. Evelyn stood in front of the classroom with the chalk still in her hand, and for the first time that morning, Professor Harris wasn't looking at her like a cleaning lady. He was looking at her like a problem he couldn't understand. She had just pointed out an error in his equation, and now every student in the room was watching the two of them. Daniel glanced at the corrected term, then back at Evelyn. "How did you notice that?" he asked. His voice had lost the joking tone from a few minutes earlier. Evelyn didn't answer right away. She looked at the board and continued writing. Her steps were slow, but every line had a purpose. She wasn't rushing to impress anyone. She wasn't trying to prove a point. She simply knew what she was doing. A student in the front row raised his hand, then lowered it again because he didn't know what question to ask. Another student whispered, "She actually knows this." Evelyn heard him but said nothing. After another minute, Daniel finally stepped closer. "Carter, where did you learn this?" Evelyn put the chalk down and looked at him. "A long time ago," she said. Daniel waited for more. "I studied mathematics," she continued. "At a university." The room became even quieter. Daniel looked surprised. "You studied mathematics?" Evelyn nodded. "Yes." One student asked, "Were you a math major?" Evelyn gave a small smile. "I was more than that. I wanted to teach it." That answer caught everyone off guard. Daniel looked at the cleaning uniform she was wearing, then at the equation covering his classroom board. The contrast suddenly felt uncomfortable. "So why are you working here?" he asked. Evelyn took a breath. She didn't look angry, but there was a sadness in her eyes. "Because sometimes life doesn't ask what you wanted to become," she said. "It asks what you need to do to survive." Nobody moved. Evelyn explained that years earlier she had been on a promising academic path. She had earned scholarships, spent long nights studying advanced mathematics, and even helped younger students understand difficult subjects. But after her mother became seriously ill and her family faced financial problems, Evelyn left school to take care of the people who needed her. She never stopped loving mathematics. She simply stopped having time for it. Then she looked back at the equation. "I still remember some things," she said quietly. Daniel stared at her, almost embarrassed by what had happened. He had invited her into the classroom to make people laugh. Instead, she had reminded everyone that intelligence doesn't always come with a title, a suit, or a university office. Daniel pointed toward the board. "Would you finish it?" Evelyn nodded. "Of course." She picked up the chalk again, and this time, Evelyn picked up the chalk again, and the room became so quiet that everyone could hear the faint sound of the clock on the wall. Professor Harris stepped away from the board and folded his arms, watching closely. He still wasn't completely convinced that Evelyn could finish the problem, but he was no longer laughing. The students had stopped whispering too. Every eye was fixed on the board. Evelyn looked at the equation one more time, took a slow breath, and began. She didn't attack the problem from the beginning like most students would. Instead, she went straight to the part that mattered most. She separated the complicated pieces, simplified them, and moved each term into place with steady confidence. Daniel watched her hand move across the board. 30 seconds had passed. 1 minute, a student quietly checked the time on his phone, then looked up again. "She's almost halfway," he whispered. Evelyn didn't seem to hear him. She was completely focused. Every line she wrote became shorter and cleaner, and the enormous equation that had looked impossible only minutes earlier was slowly becoming something understandable. Daniel finally stepped closer. He recognized the method she was using, but what surprised him was the speed. This wasn't someone remembering a formula from years ago. Evelyn was seeing the structure of the problem naturally. At the 1 minute 30-second mark, she stopped briefly and looked at the board. Daniel thought she had reached a dead end. "Need some help?" he asked, almost out of habit. Evelyn turned around and calmly said, "No, Professor, I'm just checking the last step." A few students smiled. Daniel said nothing. She continued. 2 minutes passed. The room felt completely different now. The same students who had laughed at her were leaning forward in their seats, trying to follow every step. One student began copying her work into his notebook. Another whispered, "I've never seen anyone do this that fast." Daniel looked at the clock. 2 minutes and 20 seconds. Evelyn reached the final section of the equation. She made one final adjustment, paused, and then wrote another line beneath it. Her movements became even slower as she checked every number. Nobody dared interrupt her. At 2 minutes and 50 seconds, she placed the chalk against the tray. Then she looked at the answer she had written and nodded. "That's it," she said quietly. Daniel walked toward the board. He stared at the final answer, then traced the steps back with his eyes. Everything was there, every calculation, every transition. Nothing had been skipped. 3 minutes had passed. The woman he had invited into his classroom as a joke had just done something his strongest students couldn't do under pressure. Daniel looked at Evelyn, and for the first time there was no pride in his expression. There was genuine disbelief. "This can't be right," he whispered. Evelyn simply replied, "Check it." And that's exactly what he did. "Ged." Professor Harris stared at the final answer on the board for several seconds without saying a word. He picked up his marker and slowly began checking Evelyn's work from the beginning. First line correct, second line correct. Third line correct. He kept going, expecting to find the mistake that would prove his original assumption right. But there was no mistake. Every step connected perfectly to the next one. The classroom was completely silent. Students who had laughed at Evelyn only minutes earlier were now watching their professor with the same nervous curiosity they had felt during difficult exams. Daniel reached the final line again and stopped. The answer was correct, not close, not almost correct, exactly correct. He turned toward Evelyn. "You got it," he said quietly. Evelyn nodded as if nothing unusual had happened. "Yes." Daniel looked back at the equation. "In 3 minutes. One of the students checked the time on his phone and said, "Actually, Professor, it was 2 minutes and 58 seconds. A few students smiled, but nobody laughed at Evelyn anymore. Daniel wasn't amused. He was trying to understand what had just happened. He walked closer to the board and pointed at one of her steps. "Why did you use this method?" Evelyn looked at the equation and said, "Because the longer method hides the pattern. Once you see the pattern, the problem becomes much smaller." Daniel stared at her. That was the kind of explanation he expected from someone who had spent years teaching advanced mathematics. He asked her another question, this time about one of the hardest parts of the equation. Evelyn answered immediately, then another question. She answered that too. Soon, Daniel wasn't testing her anymore. He was learning from her. The students noticed it as well. One of them raised his hand and asked Evelyn if she could explain the step in simpler words. She smiled and walked back to the board. For the next few minutes, she explained the problem in a way that even the students who had been struggling could understand. Daniel stood quietly to the side, listening. There was something humbling about watching a woman he had invited into his classroom as a joke explain his own problem better than he had. Finally, Daniel turned to the class. "Everyone," he said, "I owe Ms. Carter an apology." Evelyn looked surprised. "Professor, you don't have to." "No," Daniel interrupted gently, "I do." He looked around the room. "I made an assumption about someone because of the job she does, and I was wrong." The room stayed quiet. Then Daniel turned back toward Evelyn. "But I still have one question." Evelyn waited. "Where did you really learn to do mathematics like this?" Evelyn looked at the equation, then at the professor. A faint smile appeared on her face. "That's a much longer story," she said. And suddenly, everyone in that classroom wanted to hear it. The classroom remained quiet after Daniel's question. Everyone wanted to know the same thing. How could a woman who spent her mornings cleaning classrooms solve an advanced mathematics problem faster than a room full of university students? Evelyn looked at the professor for a moment before answering. "Because I've seen problems like this before," she said. Daniel shook his head slowly. "No, I mean, how did you see the mistake so quickly?" Evelyn smiled. "Because when you spend enough years with numbers, they start to tell you when something doesn't look right." That answer made a few students smile, but Daniel wasn't satisfied. He pulled a chair closer and sat down. "Tell us about those years." Evelyn hesitated. She wasn't used to talking about herself, especially in a classroom full of people who had never known anything about her except her uniform. Finally, she said, "I started loving mathematics when I was a little girl. My mother used to bring home old books from the library. I didn't understand everything in them, but I loved the challenge." As she spoke, her voice became warmer. She explained that by high school, mathematics had become her strongest subject. Her teachers encouraged her to apply for college, and she eventually earned a scholarship to study advanced mathematics. She wasn't just a good student, she was one of the best in her program. Daniel listened carefully as she described staying late in the library, helping classmates understand difficult problems, and dreaming about becoming a professor one day. Then her expression changed. "But life had other plans," she said. Her mother became seriously ill during her final years of university. Evelyn began working extra hours to help with medical bills while trying to keep up with her studies. Eventually, the pressure became too much. She left school before finishing the path she had planned for herself. She took whatever work she could find, supported her family, and kept moving forward. "I thought I'd go back one day," she said. "But 1 year became 5, 5 became 10, and before I knew it, I was just trying to get through each week." A student near the front asked, "So you never stopped studying?" Evelyn shook her head. "No. I just stopped studying in classrooms." She explained that she still read mathematics books whenever she had time. Sometimes she solved problems late at night after everyone else was asleep. She didn't do it for money or recognition. She did it because mathematics was one part of herself she had refused to lose. Daniel looked at her with a mixture of respect and regret. Then he asked the question that had been sitting in his mind since she walked to the board. "Evelyn, if you were this good, why didn't you ever tell anyone?" She looked around the room and quietly answered, "Because most people only see the job you have. They don't ask about the person you had to become to survive." Nobody spoke. For the first time that day, Daniel understood that the equation wasn't the most important thing Evelyn had solved. She had spent years solving a much harder problem, how to keep her dreams alive when life kept telling her to give them up. Professor Daniel Harris had spent most of his career standing at the front of classrooms, teaching students that knowledge came from preparation, discipline, and years of hard work. But that morning, he learned something he had never expected to learn from the woman who cleaned his classroom. He stood beside the board and looked at Evelyn's solution one more time. The equation was correct, but that wasn't what bothered him most. What stayed with him was the way he had treated her before she even touched the chalk. He had seen her uniform, her cleaning cart, and her position on campus, and he had decided he already knew what she was capable of. He hadn't asked about her education. He hadn't asked about her dreams. He hadn't even bothered to learn her first name. He had simply turned her into a joke because he thought the whole class would laugh. Daniel took a slow breath and faced the students. "I want everyone to pay attention," he said, "not because Ms. Carter solved this equation, but because of what I got wrong before she solved it." The students looked at him. Daniel continued, "I assumed that because she works here as a cleaner, she couldn't understand what was on this board. That was my mistake." He turned toward Evelyn. "Ms. Carter, I'm sorry. I embarrassed you in front of my students because I thought it would be funny. You didn't deserve that." Evelyn looked at him for a moment. There was no anger on her face. "Thank you," she said. "I appreciate the apology." Daniel nodded, but he wasn't finished. He picked up the chalk and wrote a simple sentence beneath the equation: "Never confuse someone's position with their potential." Then he faced the class. "That's something I should have learned years ago." One of the students raised his hand and said, "Professor, honestly, I think we all should." Daniel gave a small smile. "You're right." Then he did something that surprised everyone. He asked Evelyn to explain her method to the class. She hesitated, but Daniel stepped aside and handed her the chalk. "Please," he said, "I'd like them to hear it from you." Evelyn walked back to the board. She broke the problem down in simple language, showing the students why the equation looked harder than it really was. Even Daniel listened carefully. When she finished, the class applauded. Evelyn smiled, slightly embarrassed by the attention. Daniel joined the applause, but this time there was no joke behind it. There was respect. Before Evelyn left the room, Daniel stopped her. "You said you once wanted to teach." She looked at him. "I did." Daniel nodded. "Maybe that dream isn't as far away as you think." Evelyn didn't answer, she simply smiled. But the look in her eyes told him that, for the first time in many years, she was allowing herself to consider it again. The next morning, Evelyn almost convinced herself that yesterday had never happened. She arrived at Westbrook University before sunrise, put on her cleaning uniform, grabbed her cart, and started working just like she had done for years. She didn't expect special treatment, and she certainly didn't expect anyone to change her life because she solved one equation. But before she could finish cleaning the first hallway, Professor Harris walked toward her. He wasn't carrying a stack of papers or rushing to his next lecture. He was carrying a folder. "Evelyn, do you have a minute?" he asked. She stopped and nodded. Daniel opened the folder and showed her a university application. He explained that after speaking with the department chair, he had learned that Evelyn's old academic records could still be verified. More importantly, the university had several programs designed for adults who had been forced to leave school and wanted to return. Evelyn stared at the papers without touching them. "I haven't been a student in years," she said. Daniel smiled. "That doesn't mean you stopped being a mathematician." Those words hit her harder than she expected. For decades, Evelyn had told herself that her dream was over. She had responsibilities now, bills, family, a job. She had learned to survive without asking life for anything more. But Daniel wasn't asking her to forget those responsibilities. He was offering her a way to build something for herself again. The university offered her a chance to finish her degree with financial support and a flexible schedule. Evelyn was nervous. She worried that she was too old, too far behind, and too out of practice. Daniel told her something simple. "You solved an advanced equation in under 3 minutes without a textbook. I don't think mathematics forgot you." Evelyn laughed for the first time that morning. She accepted the opportunity. Her first weeks back in the classroom were not easy. She had to balance work, family responsibilities, and studying. Some nights she was exhausted before opening her books, but every time doubt returned, she remembered the equation on the board, and the moment the entire room went silent, slowly she became more confident. Students began asking her for help, and professors noticed how naturally she explained difficult ideas. Eventually, the university offered her a position as a mathematics teaching assistant. Evelyn stood in front of a classroom again, but this time she wasn't holding a cleaning cart. She was holding a marker. The first time she walked to the board, she looked at the rows of students and smiled. Years ago, life had taken her away from that dream. Now she was finally walking back toward it. And the woman everyone once overlooked was about to discover that sometimes a second chance doesn't look like starting over. Sometimes it looks like finally finishing what you were forced to leave behind. Months later, the halls of Westbrook University looked exactly the same, but Evelyn Carter no longer felt invisible when she walked through them. She still remembered the days when she pushed a cleaning cart through those same hallways while students hurried past without even looking at her. She remembered the morning Professor Harris had called her into his classroom as a joke, the laughter that followed, and the silence that came after she solved the equation. But now, when Evelyn walked into the mathematics building, students greeted her by name. Some even stopped her in the hallway to ask for help with a problem. She had become the teaching assistant she once dreamed of becoming, and she was working toward completing the degree she had been forced to leave behind years earlier. One afternoon, Professor Harris found her sitting alone in the same classroom where everything had started. She was preparing notes for her next lesson. Daniel stood at the doorway for a moment before walking inside. He looked at the board and smiled. "You know," he said, "I still think about that equation." Evelyn laughed. "I thought professors were supposed to move on from their mistakes." Daniel smiled. "Not that one." He sat down and told her that the story had changed the way he taught. He had started paying more attention to the people around him, instead of assuming he knew their abilities based on their job, clothes, or background. Evelyn looked at the empty classroom and said, "Sometimes people don't need someone to give them talent. They just need someone to give them a chance." Daniel nodded. That sentence stayed with him. A few minutes later, students began entering the room. Evelyn stood at the front of the class and picked up the marker. For a brief moment, she looked at the board and remembered the woman she had been months earlier. The cleaning uniform, the cart, the quiet mornings, the feeling that her best years were already behind her. Then she looked at the student sitting in front of her and smiled. Her story wasn't about proving that she was smarter than a professor. It wasn't even about solving an impossible equation in 3 minutes. It was about what happened when someone who had been overlooked finally got the chance to be seen. Evelyn had spent years believing that her dream was gone because life had forced her to put it down. But the truth was different. The dream had simply been waiting for the right moment, waiting for someone to ask one simple question: what can you do? And sometimes that's all a person needs, a chance to show the world what was inside them all along. So the next time you see someone cleaning a building, serving food, driving a bus, or working a job that people overlook, remember Evelyn. You may be looking at someone with a dream, a talent, or a story you know nothing about. Never judge a person's potential by the position they hold, because the person everyone ignores today could be the person everyone remembers tomorrow.